Hi there, I'm Square, and let's talk about art. So today I am going over my process when I create the artwork in my other video. I like to do this every time that I create an artwork because these are the type of videos I really enjoy watching. I really love to see that creative process that artists go through and hear what their thoughts were as they make the choices as they're drawing. So for this particular drawing, this was my first one in episode 0 where I'm introducing the idea for the series that I'm making. I wanted it to be relatively close to the style of Rumiko Takahashi. Now, I know it's not completely a copy, but I want it to be relatively recognizable while giving it some of my own personal touches. I also wanted to give it kind of a little more modern twist with Kagome making kind of a selfie with Inuyasha, and that let me give Inuyasha a really fun expression. Expression work is one of my favorite things to do, so that's what really pushed me in this direction, is giving him that kind of like grumpy but confused, maybe a little bit intrigued. That was pretty fun. I had to look at references of these characters a bit while I was doing this. Now, while I'm pretty familiar with the series, I haven't drawn these characters in years, a very, very long time. So I really had to look at what their design elements are, especially in the hair. The hair is really unique here. Especially on Inuyasha, like his bangs are almost like a helmet on top of his head. So I had to really look at it because it's almost like a separate hairpiece from the long part in back. So the sketch part already is done. Honestly, sketching is pretty quick for me. Then when we move on to line art, that usually takes me a bit longer. Now here's where I'm really starting to appreciate the digital medium. Now I'm much more of a traditional artist. I am a lot more comfortable working with pencils and paper, markers, watercolor, stuff like that. So digital is something I'm still learning and experimenting with. But line art in digital is so much better. Just being able to Control Z, oh my gosh, that is life-changing. Doing that kind of inking on paper for traditional is ridiculously stressful. If you mess up one line, you could ruin your whole piece. You can't just white out an area. It really, really shows, especially if you're using art paper, and especially if you want to use any type of color on top. So being able to adjust as I go and kind of be a little more loose with my lines is something that I really enjoy, especially when we get to the hair. We'll approach the hair on Inuyasha pretty quick. So the hair, I feel like when I do it traditionally, it ends up looking a little stilted. It looks a little stiff. But with the hair on digital, I'm able to be really loose with my movements because I can erase any of those lines that go astray, any of the lines that kind of peek outside of the overall piece. Not really something you could do with traditional art. Now here I'm doing the necklace for Inuyasha. This is where I slightly considered maybe I could use the circle tool, but I thought that would look a little too manufactured. Since this is a traditional necklace that was made back in feudal Japan, my thought process was it's not going to be perfect circles every time. Some might be a little lopsided, some might be a little dented, and I felt like perfect circles would really stand out like awkwardly on the page. So that's why I hand drew each of them, and they're each a little bit off, but I think it gives it kind of a homemade looking charm. Now here I'm cleaning up my lines a bit, which again is not something you can do when you're doing traditional art. I'm able to clean up some of that overlap, and again, it gives me a way to really loosen my grip a little bit and give these lines some flow. So now I'm gonna lay down, well, in a second, I'm adjusting the sizing first because I was looking at this and I'm like, this size is a little awkward. I want it to be a little bit more square shape. I felt like there's too much open space at the bottom, so I'm adjusting that. I tried moving Kagome's body a little bit because she looks like she's lunging a little, but it didn't really look how I wanted. So I went back to that kind of lean in feeling, even though it's not super duper realistic. It's like she's in the middle of a jump. I think it's a little cuter. So even though it's not a super duper real thing, I kind of lean towards the side of aesthetics sometimes. I do that in anatomy sometimes as well. Like if you want a really dynamic pose, sometimes you need to kind of break the rules a little bit. So I'm not totally against breaking the rules if you're able to create a piece that speaks to you a little bit more. Now, learning the rules I do feel is a little bit important, but rules are made to be broken a little bit. So here I'm laying down the base colors. This makes it a lot easier for shading. You just kind of pick your tones. I'm pulling some from this picture I found. I actually had a little bit of trouble finding high quality colored art of Inuyasha online. I'm not really sure why most of it was kind of like JPEG with the, the breakage in there. So I didn't have really smooth colors to work with. So instead, what I kind of had to do was pull the color and slightly adjust them once I had it on the page. Now here I'm shading. Shading skin is probably one of my favorite things to do in coloring. I feel like that's the point when things start really looking alive. Now, I usually shade skin traditionally first. Because one thing you do when you're doing traditional art is you tend to work from lighter tones to darker tones. Because the basic mind frame is if I'm working in a lighter tone and it spills into a different section, you overlap into another area. If it's the lightest tone, your darker tone is going to cover up that out of the lines coloring. So it's a bit of a habit, I guess, I've developed where I tend to do skin first almost every time when I color and gravitate a little more towards the lighter tones in an area. And you can see that here where I move on to Kagome's shirt after that. I don't do it super strictly anymore, but that's just kind of where my brain goes. Now, I had a little bit of trouble shading her shirt, especially that right arm. I don't know. I just didn't like how it looked, and I erased it a lot and went back a few times, and eventually I got it. Now here when I'm shading her little ribbon, I don't know exactly what it's called, but it was on her school uniform. I really wanted to give it a little more contrast, so I ended up tweaking those colors later. I like that high contrast look when you're doing something like cell shading. Now, cell shading isn't usually my go-to, but I feel like it looks really good digitally. Now, I'm able to blend colors a lot easier with traditional media, and I'm still kind of learning blending when it comes to digital. So cell shading I find a little bit easier, and I like how high contrast it looks and how much it kind of pops. And it really lends itself to that anime look. So I kind of go for really high contrast. You'll see lots of like bright brights next to dark darks. And speaking of contrast, now we're moving on to Inuyasha's necklace. Now with this necklace here, I wanted to really play with that illusion of depth in these colors. So when we're close up, you could really see how the colors are layered, but from far away, it gives it a kind of a shine quality, which is really fun to kind of play with. See, this is why I'm backing up a few times. I'm like, is it working? All right, I'm pretty happy with it. Now shading the hair is something that I've never been a big fan of. Hair kind of stresses me out sometimes. So I was really, really strongly referencing how Inuyasha's hair is shaded in the anime and in actual official art. And I really like this kind of chunky shading that follows these edges and gives it these little like flashes of like spikes throughout. It's really interesting. So I actually started incorporating that in some of my own other personal art, and I'm really liking that look. I'm altering it slightly just the way my hand and brain works, but overall that idea of these chunks and shading in the darkness and leaving the highlight, I'm digging that a lot. Now here I realized that her hair would show at the bottom, so I'm going to add a little bit of that in. There's a couple points where like as you're going, you can add things. Like this is one reason again why digital is a lot easier. So here I'm working on the eyes, and this is another area where I feel like zoomed in, it doesn't look nearly as good as when I zoom out. Once you zoom out, like that effect that happens, the suggestion of highlight really starts to show. Now here when I'm drawing Inuyasha's eyes, I realized later I made his pupils a little small. So when I zoomed out, I'm like, it doesn't look quite friendly enough. It looks a little aggressive. That's one little secret trick that a lot of artists use. You can really see that in Disney. Basically, whenever you make a pupil bigger, things tend to look kind of cuter and friendlier. Now I'm putting in a really, really simple background because that white just didn't work. If it's a selfie, you're somewhere. So I wanted it to be a suggestion of like outside trees, stuff like that. And overall, we're stopping where it's zoomed in a little because I kind of like the zoomed in look a bit more. And overall, I'm relatively happy with how this piece turned out. I'm seeing a couple areas where I could tweak and change, but it's honestly really great practice for me. Because again, I'm not terribly practiced with digital art. I had to watch a lot of tutorials to get to a point where I'm comfortable even cell shading. But throughout this journey I'm gonna have in art, I really want to play around with different techniques, different ideas, different styles. I've already started on my next art piece and it's completely opposite style to the one here. The shading's a little similar, but not completely. And then beyond that, I'm just trying different things. Now I'll probably end up repeating some different techniques and different styles over and over. I want to give different ideas every time. So thank you for joining me today. It was kind of fun to talk over the art because, again, I've always really enjoyed these videos. So it's kind of fun to make one myself. I was really looking forward to doing this. So I'd really appreciate if you join me again. I'll be posting different speed paints, not Inuyasha related, on this channel along with this series. And this first episode is a bit longer than I expected. I've already done some of the notes and voice work for it, and there's a lot going on in the first few chapters. So if you like what you see, like, subscribe, and all those other cheesy YouTube things. And thank you again for joining me today.